To be clear, Kairos has never voted to advocate for boycott, divestment, or sanctions against Israel, though they have been critical of Israeli human rights policies. We also now know that CEDA staff and officials shepherded and supported the Kairos applications through the new screening procedures, as they had done numerous times in previous years, all the way to Minister Bev Oda's desk, where it met its politically motivated end. We also know that the application was based precisely on the human rights priorities of CEDA, and that the funding was to go toward human rights work with partners in other parts of the world. In this regard, we know that the defunding of Kairos actually hurts those partners elsewhere, abroad, far more than it hurts the Canadian education and advocacy efforts of Kairos. So if this decision was made, as despicable as this would have been, to punish Kairos for its presumed anti-Semitism, as Jason Kenney made clear, it was severely misplaced punishment, in addition to being a completely false allegation. Number two, the government also downshifted support for the vital United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinians in the Near East, UNRWA, offering baseless allegations that some funds have been channeled to certain organizations that are characterized as terrorist. Yet no evidence is offered for such an accusation. Since none exists, it can't be found. And the UN itself continues to uphold the work of the UN RWA. It should also be noted that the agency, the only one of its kind in the world, actually only exists because the government of Israel has consistently refused to live up to its international obligations regarding treatment of internal refugees and displaced peoples. And therefore it was started as a response to the extreme suffering of the Palestinian population. This downshifting of funding will cause further suffering among those who can least afford to shoulder the burden of the education cuts and healthcare cuts and so on that are going to happen as a result. Namely, the poor, the young, the victimized, the oppressed in the territories. Number three, there have been a number of international and Canadian reports critical of the government of Israel regarding its mistreatment of Palestinians. Yet our government has systematically suppressed each of them, depriving the Canadian people of important information and contextual evidence regarding the reality on the ground for Palestinians. The landmark Goldstone report, written by a Zionist Jew, the reports of Special UN Rapporteur Richard Falk, and even the report of the independent parliamentary delegation to Palestine have all been suppressed and enjoy little or no public attention, despite the neutrality and credentials of their authors, particularly the first two I mentioned. They are available on our information table. We find this suppression of credible and qualified dissent from Israeli policy to not only be lamentable, but undemocratic. And we call upon Canadians to familiarize themselves with these reports in the absence of, and even vacuum in, leadership from our governing politicians. 4. The government has also made a series of unbalanced and even biased appointments to the Board of Rights and Democracy, an organization that once enjoyed a high level of credibility and legitimacy as a research and reporting agency that supported the struggle for and sought the upholding of human rights around the world. The appointments soon led to internal conflict, resignations of board members in protest and dissent, and in the end the takeover of the board by narrow political interests. Relatively small grants to 3 Middle East agencies, B'Tselem, Al-Haq, and Al-Mizan, all of whom have criticized not just Israeli but also Palestinian human rights violations, were made last year and then repudiated early this year by the new board. Almost the entire staff, we're told 45 of 47 staffers within Rights and Democracy, are demanding the firing of board chair Aurel Braun, along with his biased supporters after the well-respected president of the group, Remy Beauregard, died of a heart attack after an openly conflictual meeting last month. Former chairs, including Warren Almond and Ed Broadbent of Rights and Democracy, are calling for an investigation and openly lament the suppression of balance in favor of an uncritically pro-Israel agenda in the board. My last point is number 5. There are more things to say, and others will say certain things about other events and decisions, but we mentioned one last one, namely the unaccountable and unrepresentative Canadian Parliamentary Coalition to combat anti-Semitism. We support all efforts, of course, to root out real and dangerous anti-Semitism, as was mentioned earlier, but we fear that the CPCCA has an agenda to equate any criticism of Israel or any mention of boycott, divestment, and sanctions as anti-Semitic. And this is a real and current danger that would lead to the criminalization of democratic debate in Canada regarding Israel's political life, agenda, and their upholding of international law. But I close with the lifting up of a call from the Palestinian people themselves, contained in a vitally important document that we have copies of available today, which was released in December of last year, for the international community to support boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, particularly economic boycott of illegal Israeli-produced goods within the occupied territories, as other means of applying international pressure, such as UN resolutions over the many years in which they've been in place, and political demands have fallen far short for far too long of justice. We call upon the Canadian government and the Canadian people to undertake a response to this plaintive cry of the suffering Palestinian people and implement such actions. And we call upon the government of Israel to uphold its obligations to international law and implement political, social, and cultural reforms which will ensure that the human rights of Palestinians are finally and forever protected. Thank you for listening to my statement.